Tonight, we travel to the early 20th century, as this story leads us to the United States. Louise Peete was born Louise Preslar on September 20th, 1880, in Bienville, Louisiana. Her father worked as a printer, spending long hours supporting the household, while her mother remained at home, raising the couple's 3 daughters. Before her name ever appeared in court records, people had already begun to notice that something was wrong. Items went missing, explanations shifted, and those closest to her began to disappear from view. Louise Peete was born into circumstances that on record appeared unremarkable. There was nothing in her early background that suggested notoriety or future attention. However, as she grew older, official accounts began to note a series of incidents that would quietly shape her reputation. As a young girl, she was placed in a boarding school environment. It was there that the first documented concerns emerged. Items belonging to others were reported missing, and suspicion repeatedly fell on Louise. These incidents did not result in formal charges, but they were recorded and addressed through internal discipline. Her time at the school ended not through graduation, but removal. Similar patterns followed in subsequent placements. Accusations of dishonesty appeared again, each time involving personal property that could not be accounted for. In response, Louise was moved on rather than formally confronted. Authorities and caretakers chose separation over escalation, allowing the matter to close without official consequence. By the time she reached adulthood, these incidents had formed an informal but persistent reputation. She was known to leave structured environments under unfavorable circumstances, though rarely with a documented explanation. No single event prompted legal action, and none were treated as serious offenses on their own. Each episode appeared minor. Recorded together, they reveal the early outline of a pattern, one that would later resurface under far more serious conditions. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if you value carefully researched historical cases like this, make sure to subscribe and leave a like. Stability appeared to arrive through marriage, but it did not last. As Louise Peete entered adulthood, her life began to take on the outward shape of permanence. Marriage brought shared homes, shared finances, and the appearance of settled routine. On record, these relationships suggested order rather than instability. Yet within these domestic arrangements, familiar issues soon resurfaced. In each household, Louise gained access to money and personal property. Financial dependence shifted gradually, with responsibilities and control often moving into her hands. During these periods, accusations of missing items appeared again, echoing earlier concerns from her youth. As before, the matters were handled quietly. Disputes were resolved through separation rather than formal complaint. What followed were abrupt departures. Marriages ended, residences were vacated, and Louise moved on with little explanation recorded. In some cases, individuals closely connected to her were no longer present after these transitions. Their absences were noted but not pursued. Explanations were accepted and daily life continued. Authorities remained uninvolved, no official investigations were opened and no charges were filed. Each incident, viewed alone, appeared insufficient to warrant action. Financial disagreements, marital breakdowns, and unexplained departures were treated as private matters. By the time these relationships concluded, a quiet pattern had already begun to take shape. Access was followed by conflict, conflict by departure, and departure by unanswered questions that for the moment remained unresolved. Each time she moved on, the past did not fully disappear with her. In the years that followed, Louise Peete continued to relocate, moving between households, positions, and communities. The circumstances of each move were rarely recorded in detail, but familiar concerns appeared with regularity. Property went missing, questions were raised, explanations were offered. Then the arrangement ended. Employers chose not to pursue complaints. Acquaintances withdrew rather than confront. Relationships dissolved without formal dispute. In each case, separation resolved the immediate problem, and Louise moved on before any official response was required. No arrests were made, no hearings were scheduled. The pattern remained informal, sustained by silence rather than documentation. As these incidents accumulated, perception began to shift. Though no legal record followed her, word traveled quietly. She was known to leave positions under strained circumstances, often after disagreements involving personal belongings or finances. Still, the absence of formal action allowed her to continue finding new opportunities. The narration at this stage is marked by what does not occur. Authorities are not notified, complaints are not filed. Each episode ends just short of intervention, reinforcing how easily concerns were dismissed as private matters. This period concludes with Louise entering a new household, one markedly different from those before. The setting is defined by age, isolation, and considerable assets. For the first time, the conditions exist not merely for dispute, but for irreversible consequence. In the Denton household, access came easily, and oversight did not. Louise Peete entered the home of Jacob Denton in the role of housekeeper. Denton was an older man, living a largely private life, with limited close family nearby. The arrangement placed Louise in daily control of the household, its routines, its records, and its personal effects. Her responsibilities extended beyond basic domestic work. She handled correspondence, maintained financial papers, and had unrestricted access to Denton's belongings. Over time, those who visited the home observed changes that drew quiet notice. Louise was seen wearing jewelry that had not previously been associated with her. Spending appeared to increase, though no explanation was formally recorded. When asked about these matters, Louise offered ordinary accounts. The explanations were accepted. Denton himself did not contradict them. To outside observers, the household appeared orderly, and no complaint was raised. As weeks passed, Jacob Denton was seen less frequently. Visitors were told he was unwell or resting. The explanations varied slightly but did not prompt alarm. Mail continued to be collected. Business matters appeared to be handled. From the outside, there was no immediate indication that anything was amiss. Still, subtle concern began to form. Denton's absence lengthened, and questions became harder to dismiss. Those familiar with his habits noticed the change, even if they did not act on it. The chapter closes with Jacob Denton still officially residing in the house, but increasingly unseen, while Louise Peete remains in full control of the household, its finances, and its narrative. The explanations changed, but the questions did not. As time passed, Jacob Denton was no longer seen by those who had previously visited the house with some regularity. His absence was not immediate or dramatic. It unfolded gradually, marked first by missed encounters and later by prolonged silence. When inquiries were made, Louise Peete offered explanations calmly and without hesitation. To some she said Denton was unwell and preferred privacy. To others she suggested he had left town or was receiving care elsewhere. The details varied slightly, but the tone remained steady. No urgency was expressed, and no request for assistance was made. Despite Denton's continued absence, household and financial activity did not cease. Mail was collected, bills were addressed, transactions were conducted in his name. These actions gave the appearance that his affairs remained in order, even as he himself remained unseen. Visitors and acquaintances began to compare notes. Individually, the explanations seemed reasonable. Taken together, they no longer aligned. Questions were raised about Denton's condition and whereabouts, though no one yet assumed wrongdoing. Requests were made for direct contact or confirmation, but these were deferred or unanswered. What had once been casual curiosity shifted into quiet concern. The absence extended beyond what could be explained by illness or travel. With no clear resolution offered, informal inquiries began to move outward, reaching individuals with reason to seek verification. The chapter ends at the moment when private explanations begin to lose their effect and the matter edges toward formal attention. When authorities entered the house, the story changed permanently. After concerns reached individuals with the authority to act, the Denton residence was examined. The process began as a verification effort intended to establish Jacob Denton's condition and location. What followed was methodical and procedural, guided by the inconsistencies already noted. Attention was directed to areas of the property that had not been previously accessible to visitors. Investigators observed conditions beneath the structure that warranted closer inspection. The ground showed signs of recent disturbance, inconsistent with ordinary maintenance. Based on these observations, further examination was ordered. What was found beneath the house confirmed that Jacob Denton was deceased. The discovery immediately resolved the uncertainty surrounding his absence. Identification was established through documented means, and the matter moved beyond inquiry. From that point forward, there was no question of illness, travel, or voluntary departure. With confirmation obtained, the case was formally reclassified. What had begun as a request for clarification became a criminal investigation governed by statute and procedure. The residence was secured, and records associated with Denton's affairs were reviewed in full. Louise Peete was taken into custody shortly thereafter. The action was carried out without incident and recorded as an administrative necessity following confirmed findings. There were no statements made for the record at that time. The chapter closes at the point of transition. Speculation ends. Explanations are no longer relevant. The case now exists within the legal system, where responsibility is determined not by narrative, but by evidence. What had been concealed within a private home was now examined in a public courtroom. Following her arrest, formal charges were filed in connection with the death of Jacob Denton. The case proceeded to trial, where the circumstances surrounding his disappearance and death were presented for judicial review. Proceedings unfolded according to standard court procedure, with evidence introduced in sequence and examined in full view of the jury. Material findings from the Denton residence were entered into the record, alongside documentation related to financial activity and household control during the period of Denton's absence. Witnesses testified to observations made before concerns were raised, describing changes in routine and access within the home. Each account was considered individually, then collectively, as part of the broader timeline. Throughout the proceedings, Louise Peete's conduct was noted by those present. Contemporary reports described her manner as composed and attentive. She followed the process closely and responded when required, without visible disruption to the court. After the presentation of evidence concluded, the jury was instructed and withdrew to deliberate. The deliberation period was brief. When the jury returned, a verdict was delivered finding Louise Peete guilty. With that decision, the case moved from investigation to judgment. For the first time, the earlier sequence of unresolved incidents culminated in formal accountability. The chapter ends at the moment the verdict is recorded, marking a definitive shift from suspicion to legal consequence. Conviction ended the trial, but not the story. Following the verdict, Louise Peete was sentenced in accordance with the court's decision and transferred into the state prison system. The sentence removed her from public view and placed her within an institutional framework defined by routine, regulation, and record-keeping. From that point forward, her life was documented not through testimony, but through reports and evaluations. Years passed without notable incident. Daily life was structured and repetitive, marked by compliance rather than conflict. Institutional records from this period describe consistent behavior and adherence to established rules. There were no disturbances requiring formal discipline and no events that altered the terms of her confinement. As time progressed, these records became part of routine administrative review. Assessments were conducted periodically, focusing on conduct, adjustment, and eligibility under existing statutes. The process unfolded slowly, governed by policy rather than public interest. Eventually, the question of parole entered official consideration. This did not indicate a change in judgment, but reflected the passage of time and the procedures applied to long-term sentences. Recommendations and evaluations were compiled, reviewed, and forwarded through established channels. The chapter closes at this point of transition. Louise Peete remained confined, but no longer outside review. The story moves from judgment to waiting, and from waiting to the possibility of reconsideration, setting the stage for what would follow. After years of confinement, the state determined that release was appropriate. Following periodic reviews of her institutional record, Louise Peete's case was brought before the parole board. The decision was based on documented conduct during incarceration, length of time served, and statutory eligibility. Evaluations submitted to the board reflected sustained compliance with prison regulations and an absence of disciplinary issues. After deliberation, parole was granted. Release was not unconditional. Specific terms were attached, outlining where Louise could reside and how her activities would be monitored. She was required to report regularly and remain under supervision, with any deviations subject to review. The process followed established procedure, recorded through formal approval rather than public announcement. Upon release, Louise was assigned a place of residence approved by authorities. Her movements were limited and her circumstances documented. Efforts to establish routine followed shortly thereafter. She sought work and began re-entering daily life under the constraints of supervision, presenting the appearance of adjustment and stability. There was no indication on record of immediate concern. The structures put in place were designed to manage risk and ensure accountability. For a period, they appeared to function as intended. The chapter closes with Louise once again living within a household setting. Though no longer confined, her life remained governed by oversight and documentation. The return to domestic routine marked a new phase, one shaped by observation rather than confinement, and carried expectations that had already been tested once before. The arrangement appeared ordinary, and at first unremarkable. After her release on parole, Louise Peete became associated with Margaret Logan, a woman who offered companionship and assistance within her household. The relationship developed gradually, grounded in routine interaction rather than formal agreement. Louise took on responsibilities that placed her in close contact with the daily functioning of the home. Arthur Logan, Margaret's husband, was present but limited by his condition. His circumstances reduced his ability to manage household affairs, creating a reliance on others for support. As a result, Louise's role expanded beyond basic assistance. She handled errands, correspondence, and other practical matters that required trust and regular access. Over time, financial responsibilities within the household were shared. Louise was entrusted with tasks involving payments and documentation, reflecting a level of confidence extended to her by Margaret Logan. These arrangements were not unusual on their own and drew no immediate attention. To outside observers, the household appeared stable and its routines uninterrupted. The narration records these developments without interpretation, noting only the sequence in which responsibility shifted. As before, access increased alongside familiarity. The household operated quietly with no complaints or visible conflict. By the close of this chapter, all individuals are accounted for, and daily life continues as expected. Louise Peete is once again positioned within a domestic setting that provides trust, access, and financial involvement. The conditions are established calmly and without incident, setting the stage for the events that will soon follow. The first indication of trouble did not come from absence, but from paperwork. The matter surfaced through routine financial activity attributed to Margaret Logan. Documents issued in her name began to draw attention, not because of their amounts, but because of their form. Checks were presented, and correspondence circulated that did not align with her known habits. To those familiar with her handwriting and manner of handling affairs, the discrepancies were noticeable. Questions were raised quietly at first. Individuals accustomed to Margaret Logan's involvement found it unusual that transactions appeared to proceed without her direct participation. Authorization became a point of concern. Handwriting was examined and compared against prior records, revealing inconsistencies that could not be easily explained. At the same time, attention turned toward Louise Peete's parole obligations. Reports and paperwork associated with her supervision were reviewed as part of standard oversight. Irregularities in these records prompted further inquiry, linking administrative review with the emerging financial concerns. What began as a request for clarification soon extended beyond the household. Outside parties were contacted to verify Margaret Logan's status and confirm her involvement in recent transactions. The responses did not resolve the uncertainty. Instead, they widened it. As the questions accumulated, the matter shifted from private doubt to formal attention. Authorities were notified, not on the basis of disappearance, but due to documentation that no longer aligned with known facts. The chapter closes as it becomes clear that written records alone are no longer sufficient, and direct verification is required. When the property was examined, the uncertainty ended. Following the unresolved questions surrounding Margaret Logan's status, investigators arrived at the Logan residence to conduct a formal verification. The visit was administrative in purpose, intended to confirm her whereabouts and resolve the inconsistencies identified through documentation. What followed was a methodical examination of the property. Attention was directed first to the interior of the house, where routine checks failed to establish Margaret Logan's presence. From there, investigators expanded their examination to the surrounding grounds. Based on information obtained during the inquiry, focus shifted to an area of the garden that appeared recently disturbed. The condition of the soil differed from the surrounding ground, prompting further inspection. Upon examination beneath the surface, remains were discovered. The finding immediately resolved the outstanding questions regarding Margaret Logan's absence. Identification was established through documented means, confirming that she was deceased. With this determination, the matter moved decisively beyond administrative review. The case was immediately reclassified. What had begun as a request for verification became a criminal investigation governed by established procedure. The property was secured, and relevant records were collected for review. Louise Peete was taken into custody once again following the discovery. Her prior conviction became relevant to the proceedings that would follow, forming part of the official record. The chapter closes with the investigative phase concluded, and the matter formally transferred to the court system, where the final stage of the case would be addressed. The second case followed familiar lines, but the outcome would not be the same. Following the discovery at the Logan residence, formal charges were filed in connection with the death of Margaret Logan. The case proceeded to trial, returning the narrative once again to the courtroom. While the structure of the proceedings mirrored those of the earlier case, the context had changed significantly. Louise Peete now appeared before the court with a prior conviction already part of the official record. This history was acknowledged within the proceedings and shaped how evidence was presented and evaluated. Documentation, timelines, and physical findings from the Logan residence were introduced methodically, establishing the sequence of events leading to Margaret Logan's death. Witnesses testified to administrative matters, financial records, and observations made during the period in question. As before, the narration records these proceedings without interpretation, focusing on how the case was constructed, rather than how it was argued. Courtroom observations note that the process moved efficiently, guided by established procedure and precedent. After the presentation of evidence concluded, the jury was instructed and withdrew to deliberate. When they returned, a verdict was delivered, finding Louise Peete guilty. Sentencing followed in accordance with state law, reflecting both the nature of the offense and the defendant's prior conviction. With this decision, the legal process reached its conclusion. Appeals and reviews would follow as required, but the judgment itself was final. The chapter closes at the point where the court's role ends and the outcome is formally recorded. The state's decision brought the case to an administrative end. Following sentencing, Louise Peete was transferred into state custody to await the outcome determined by the court. Her placement followed standard procedure, and her status was recorded within the appropriate institutional system. From that point forward, the case moved through its remaining stages without public proceedings. Final appeals and reviews were filed and examined in accordance with law. Each was addressed through established legal channels, with outcomes documented but not expanded upon. No reversals were issued. The sentence remained in effect. On the scheduled date, the sentence was carried out at the designated facility. The procedure followed state protocol, overseen by officials tasked with its execution. Official confirmation of death was issued shortly thereafter, and the record was finalized. With this confirmation, the legal process concluded. All pending matters related to the case were closed, and responsibility for further action ceased. The courts, correctional system, and reviewing authorities completed their roles as defined by statute. The narration ends where the records end. No further statements were entered, and no additional findings were pursued. The case passed from active review into historical record, preserved through documentation rather than interpretation. What remains is not an assessment or a lesson, but a complete administrative account, beginning with early incidents noted in passing and ending with formal closure issued by the state.